want to thank all of you for attending. Good afternoon. I'm Wayne Motts, the Chief Executive Officer here at the National Civil War Museum, and we are very happy you're here for this special kickoff of a brand new book title. And we've got it here first, thanks to Nancy, the author, and Gettysburg Publishing. The first copy is available here, and the presentation that we will have today. I want to thank my staff. Brett Kelly, our curator, is right here. Katie in the back, she is watching over the special artifacts that Brett has pulled. She has orders to shoot to kill, as always, if anybody decides they want to take off with any of these artifacts. So she is back there. Kate McDermott of our staff has an event upstairs, and she was here earlier, and all our facilities folks, I want to thank them for getting this all set up on a very busy day for the National Civil War Museum here in December. I also want to thank two of our volunteer board members. Remember, everybody, as Chief Executive Officer, I get paid. They don't. They work for free tirelessly to support this museum. That's Mike Knight sitting right here. Mike, kind of wave your hand. And Randy Gressman right here. So we want to thank our board members for their support here at the National Civil War Museum. This is a great topic of interest to me personally, and I was really happy that Nancy could come and present it and talk about it here today, and I know she spent a lot of time working on it. You're a Civil War soldier, ladies and gentlemen. You get paid to be shot at, and you usually carry a gun and can shoot back. You're a chaplain. You're in a different category, even though some of these chaplains took matters into their own hands. Their story is extremely unique, and it's a group of individuals that you often don't hear a lot about related to the American Civil War. And I know Nancy's going to shed some great light on it, and she's the best person to do it. So let me tell you a little bit about her, and then I'll tell you a little bit about this topic. The Reverend Dr. Nancy Jill Hale is a United Methodist pastor and serves at a church in Fayetteville, Pennsylvania, not very far from here. She also is a brand new, I can say that because I'm old, a brand new licensed battlefield guide at the Gettysburg National Military Park. So she's just, what a tremendous effort to pass that test, and she's just a newly minted battlefield guide, so she's a colleague of mine. Her research is focused on the lives and stories of Union chaplains, and she portrays the only woman to serve as a chaplain in the Civil War, Ella Gibson Hobart. And her novel, Faith and Duty, describes challenges of a fictional chaplain as he learns how to be faithful both to God and to the men in his community, and they enlist to serve in the Federal Army. So she has a novel she's written about chaplains that's also out on the table, and of course this new book, which you want to make and get your copy. And if you have anyone interested in faith, your pastor, anyone interested in faith, this is a book that would make a wonderful gift right around the Christmas time. So we can sell that today. And all of the proceeds, they're benefiting the Civil War Museum here today. So you want to pick up your copy. She's going to talk today, title of the book, A Sight Never to Be Forgotten. Civil War chaplains serve not only as captains on their regimental field staff, but also as pastors, confidants, spiritual guides, paternal figures for the soldiers, many of them willing to share the hardships of Army life and undertook various tasks that would help the men. Some chaplains risked their lives and freedom for the sake of their sense to duty to God and to the regiments. In their accounts, they share the perspective of men. Main concern was the spiritual and moral well-being of the soldiers. And these stories, some of which have not been shared in print, shed a different and sometimes very poignant light on the lives, faith, and sense of duty of the men in the Army before, during, and after the battle. This presentation will introduce Civil War chaplaincy and a few stories of the chaplains at the Battle of Gettysburg. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Reverend and licensed guide Nancy Jill Hale. There you go. And I think you're all set there. We'll make sure our media thing is all working.
Good afternoon. And I want to thank Wayne and the Civil War Museum for inviting me to be here. I want to thank my publisher, Kevin Drake from Gettysburg Publishing. He was the first one to really catch my passion for this topic, and he has been so supportive. I spent a little over 2 years doing research for this book, and Kevin and others helped me pull it together, and I am just so delighted to share it with you today. And I've been asked to reiterate that this book would make a wonderful Christmas present. So late in the afternoon, on July 2nd, 1863, the Third Corps of the Army of the Potomac was in big trouble. Their line of battle along the Emmitsburg Road and in the wheat field and at the peach orchard was in big trouble as Confederates were attacking and starting to crumple up their line. General Sickles's men desperately needed help, and so Major General Winfield Scott Hancock of the Second Corps ordered Brigadier General John Caldwell to send some of his men out to help support the Third Corps line. As Caldwell's division prepared to move out, Lieutenant Colonel St. Clair Mulholland of the 116th Pennsylvania in Colonel Patrick Kelly's Irish Brigade described what he saw. Hancock quietly remarks, "Caldwell, get your division ready. Soon, the 4 brigades of the division are ready for the fray. There are yet a few minutes to spare, and the time is occupied by one of the most impressive religious ceremonies I have ever witnessed." The Irish Brigade stood in column of regiments, and the chaplain of the brigade, Reverend William Corby, proposed to give a general absolution to all the men before they entered the fight. Father Corby stood upon a large rock in front of the brigade and urged the men to make a sincere act of contrition and to do their duty well. Every man fell on his knees with his head bowed down. Then, stretching his right hand toward the brigade, Father Corby pronounced the words of the general absolution. The scene was more than impressive. It was awe-inspiring. While there was profound silence in the ranks of the Second Corps, yet over to the left, out by the peach orchard in Little Round Top, the roar of the battle rose and swelled and echoed through the woods, making music more sublime than ever sounded through a cathedral. Another chaplain of the same Second Corps Division was Reverend John H.W. Stuckenberg of the 145th Pennsylvania Infantry. He was standing nearby, and he watched as Father Corby offered this prayer for his troops. And Reverend Stuckenberg felt deeply moved to think that some of his own men would soon enter the battle and never return. So he asked his colonel if he could also offer a prayer for his men. And he later wrote, "The occasion was a very solemn one. It was the last prayer in which some of our regiment joined." Father Corby is probably the most well-known Civil War chaplain. His monument at Gettysburg, which some people somewhat irreverently call Fair Catch Corby, stands along Hancock Avenue just a bit south of the Pennsylvania Monument and probably a little further south than where he actually stood when he gave that absolution. There is a similar monument of Father Corby on the campus of the University of Notre Dame, where he served as president after the war. His monument at Gettysburg is the only one to a chaplain on an American battlefield. And, as some people are surprised to learn, Chaplain Stuckenberg is the only Civil War chaplain buried in the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. I started to study the Civil War several years ago, and because I am a United Methodist pastor, I was naturally drawn to those stories about chaplains, especially Union chaplains. I wanted to learn about their lives and about their work and their sense of duty. As I started to read the things I was finding, letters and articles and memoirs and biographies about and by these chaplains, I realized that because of their special position that they held in the Army, that these men could offer a somewhat different perspective on a military campaign and on life in the Army than we might find in a regimental history or in the official reports or a memoir written by a commander. And as I read more of these stories, I knew that they had to be told. As Wayne said, chaplains were officers on the regimental field staff, but they did not have command authority. They stood outside the chain of command. That meant that of all the officers, the chaplains were free to mingle with and among the soldiers, and they were able to get to know the men more intimately than any of the other officers. And because many of the chaplains did indeed see their chaplains as spiritual guides, confidants, paternal figures, then the men were more willing to share with their chaplains their thoughts, their feelings, even their fears. In addition, because many chaplains had been pastors of churches in the communities where regiments had been recruited, there was already a sense of familiarity between the chaplains and some of the soldiers. Because of this close association that they had with the soldiers, chaplains had their fingers on the emotional and spiritual and physical pulse of the men in the regiment, and they were better able to sense the mood and the morale of the men in the ranks. For instance, when the 11th Pennsylvania Infantry was marching towards Pennsylvania in June 1863, they learned that the Army of the Potomac had received yet another new commander, their 5th commander-in-chief in 2 years. Well, their chaplain, William Henry Locke, noted, "With an army less patriotic or less intelligent, the effect would have been full of disaster. But there comes an hour in the experience of every true soldier when he feels that victory depends not so much on the commander as on himself, on his own fidelity to duty. Such an hour came to the Army of the Potomac, and every man was nerved for the work before him." Chaplain Stuckenberg of the 145th Pennsylvania wrote, "On the battlefield, just before entering the battle, men think and feel as they have never thought or felt before, and men pray there who have never prayed before. They are, before the battle, fully aware of the danger that they will be exposed to. I have watched the bravest men grow pale, their lips quivering, and their frames trembling as they stepped up to me, some to bid me goodbye, others to give me letters or money or watches to send to their families in case they were killed. The feelings of these men can only be experienced, never described." And Chaplain Philus Cook of the 94th New York Infantry recalled his experience as he watched his men rush into battle at Gettysburg on July 1st. "Never shall I forget my emotions and the expressions on the countenances of the boys as we exchanged words and glances while they passed by me to encounter the perils of the battlefield. I tried to say an encouraging word and to cheer them on to their fearful work. In general, though, they seemed cheerful and resolute." I'd like to give you a little background on Civil War chaplaincy in general. Now, although military chaplains have played a role in every conflict since the Revolutionary War, their numbers have been relatively few, and they had always been volunteers. But then came the Civil War, with a huge army and a need for many more chaplains. As the volunteer regiments were organized by the northern states, sometimes a pastor from the area where the unit was recruited would be invited to join the men. But this would still be an informal arrangement with no official expectations and no pay. In May of 1861, the War Department issued general orders which officially provided for one chaplain for each volunteer and regular regiment, who would be selected by the vote of the field officers and company commanders, and who would be duly ordained ministers of a Christian denomination. The problem was that these orders were never backed up with any kind of legislative authority, and so some Army paymasters simply refused to pay these chaplains. So in July 1861, a special session of Congress passed another act that clearly recognized the official role of chaplains as part of the Army and specified their pay and allowances. The pay and allowances they would receive pay and allowances of a captain of cavalry, which at the time was $1,746 per year. And chaplains would be required to file reports at the end of each quarter to their commander. And they would have to report on the moral and religious condition of the regiment and offer to the commander such suggestions as may conduce to the social happiness and moral improvement of the troops. Now, although Congress expected chaplains to be duly ordained ministers, potential chaplains in the beginning were not required to show any credentials. Some men were naturally attracted to the opportunity to serve as officers in the Army and receive a decent salary, but not having to drill or train or pick up a gun and go into battle. And so early in the war, some men who had no credentials at all, sometimes who had no theological training, knew nothing about the Bible, would apply for a commission, and sometimes they received it. Now, as you can imagine, chaplains such as that, who were unfit for their office, caused a lot of problems for the Army, especially for the soldiers who expected to have a strong spiritual guide with them. So in July of 1862, Congress went at it again and tightened the requirements for chaplains. Henceforth, a chaplain would need to be a regularly ordained minister of some religious denomination and would be required to show recommendations from either an authorized ecclesiastical body or from not less than 5 accredited ministers. Now, some senators felt that $1,746 a year was just far too much to be paying these chaplains in the volunteer regiments because, as one senator proclaimed, they have so little to do. So the debate was settled with the same act. The compensation of all chaplains in the regular or volunteer service or Army hospitals shall be $100 a month, which was a significant decrease in pay, but the Army made up for it by providing 2 rations a day and forage for 1 horse when on duty. Now, the Secretary of War issued an order specifying that chaplains should wear a plain black military frock coat with one row of 9 black buttons and plain black trousers, and a cap the same as the other staff members would wear. But this order was never officially required or enforced. Now, because chaplains were part of the regimental field staff, they could choose if they wanted to wear a full uniform of a captain, including shoulder boards and a sash, and even carry an ornamental sword. Some chaplains believed that by dressing like this, they would have more authority and more respect from the men in the ranks. However, many chaplains chose to wear their own clothes, with no outward sign of their ranks, because they believed a chaplain should be identified by his character and not by any outward symbols. The bottom line is that there was a wide variety of dress among chaplains, but at least one chaplain who chose to wear all the trappings of his rank as captain paid for it with his life. Reverend Horatio Stockton Howe was the chaplain of the 90th Pennsylvania Infantry. On July 1st at Gettysburg, he was caring for wounded soldiers at Christ Lutheran Church on Chambersburg Street. Sergeant Archibald Snow of the 97th New York was also at the church having his own wounds tended. He described what he witnessed as the Confederates were chasing the retreating Union forces through the town late that afternoon. I was leaving through the front door just behind Chaplain Howell when the advanced skirmishers of the Confederates were coming up the street on a run. Howell, in addition to the shoulder straps and uniform, wore a straight-dressed sword. The first Confederate skirmisher arrived at the foot of the church steps just as the chaplain and I came out. Placing one foot on the first step, the soldier called on the chaplain to surrender. But Howell, instead of throwing up his hands promptly and uttering the usual "I surrender," attempted to give some dignified explanation to the fact that he was a non-combatant when a shot from the skirmisher's rifle ended the controversy. And there is a monument to Chaplain Howell in front of Christ Lutheran Church at Gettysburg. Now, as the acts of Congress had prescribed, chaplains were supposed to be elected by the regimental staff and by company officers. Often a priest or a pastor who was well known to one of the officers would be put forth as a candidate, and thus the officers would quickly approve his commission. But some chaplains were promoted to the chaplaincy from within the ranks of the regiment. William H. Stevens was an ordained Methodist minister, but he enlisted in the 148th Pennsylvania as a soldier, and he was made lieutenant of Company H. Well, one night, Colonel James A. Beaver summoned Stevens and said, "Lieutenant, which would you prefer? To retain your present position with the possibility of promotion, or to become our chaplain?" Stevens replied, "My business is preaching. I would rather be chaplain." Colonel Beaver said, "Well, then go sell your sword and buy a Bible." Colonel Beaver later explained that he wanted a chaplain who came from the men rather than to the men. He wanted one who would freely mingle among the men, win their confidence, and help them to bear the strain of camp and march and battle. In at least one case that we know of, it was not just the staff officers who cast votes for their chaplain. Father Joseph B. O'Hagan was a candidate for chaplain in the 73rd New York Infantry in Daniel Sickles' Excelsior Brigade. Now, perhaps because Sickles was a political man, he believed that all the men in the regiment should be able to cast a vote for their chaplain. And according to Father O'Hagan, of all the votes cast, over 400 voted for a Catholic priest, 154 for any kind of Protestant minister, 11 for a Mormon elder, and 335 said they could find their way to hell without the assistance of clergy. Tough group. Over the course of the war in the Union Army, there were 32 naval chaplains, 32 post chaplains, 178 hospital chaplains, and 2,138 regimental chaplains. And out of those, 38% were Methodist, and there were other denominations represented as well. Now, some chaplains joined their regiments at the beginning of their term of service, which means they could spend time with the men in camp while the regiment was training, so the chaplains could get to know the men a little better and could ease into the rigors of Army life and of the battlefield. But other chaplains were indoctrinated into their tasks by a baptism of fire. James Frederick Calkins joined his new regiment as the chaplain of the 149th Pennsylvania Bucktails just 3 weeks before their brutal fight on the fields west of Gettysburg on July 1st, where the regiment suffered a staggering 74% casualty rate. Now, neither the Army nor the War Department ever clearly outlined the duties of a chaplain. However, chaplains were expected to enhance the effectiveness of troops by encouraging them, by demonstrating their cause, and by stimulating their patriotic loyalty. Sounds good, but It was left up to each individual chaplain to figure out how best to accomplish that. And as many chaplains discovered, it wasn't always easy. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Tilden of the 16th Maine wanted to make sure that his chaplain, George Bullen, knew exactly what was expected of him. This is what Lieutenant Colonel Tilden wrote. The chaplain of our regiment shall have charge, control, and supervision of the postal affairs of the regiment, and he shall also have charge of the religious affairs. It's interesting that Tilden listed handling the mail as a chaplain's first priority. But as one chaplain discovered, even that mundane task was not without peril. When the 2nd United States sharpshooters were marching toward Gettysburg in June, their chaplain, Lorenzo Barber, stayed behind to fetch the mail in Washington. On his way back to his regiment, he stopped in Emmitsburg, and he and the mail were captured by Confederates. While the rebels were rifling through the mail bags, Barber managed to escape, but he was not able to rejoin his regiment in time to fight with them at Gettysburg. Now, chaplains were not expected, and sometimes they were explicitly told not to pick up a gun and go into battle, but there were exceptions. Chaplain Lorenzo Barber was widely known as the fighting chaplain. He had been recruited into Hiram Burden's elite unit of sharpshooters because of his superior skills with a rifle, and he often served beside the men in battle. As one of the sharpshooters wrote, the chaplain gets his gun up to Johnny's face, says, "God have mercy on your poor soul," and then he lets her go, and down comes Mr. Johnny. Another chaplain who chose to fight with his men was Arthur Buckminster Fuller of the 16th Massachusetts. In December of 1862, his health had been worn down by the rigors of Army life to the point that he requested leave. As soon as he received his discharge papers, he learned that members of his regiment were about to cross the Rappahannock River to attempt a landing in Fredericksburg, which was strongly held by Confederate soldiers. Now, even though he had been released from duty and was free to go home, he went with the men, and he picked up a musket and fought beside them through the streets of Fredericksburg until he was shot and fell dead with his gun in his hand. Fuller was one of 11 Union chaplains who were killed in action. The Army never specified where a chaplain should be when the regiment went into battle. Many chaplains chose to remain in the rear with the surgeons so that they would be ready to receive and care for the wounded as they were brought back to the field hospitals. But other chaplains believed their proper place was near the front with their men, with the regimental staff, unarmed, but ready to help with the wounded as soon as they went down. Moses Cook Welch, who unfortunately I cannot find a picture of. Wayne, if you ever find a picture of Reverend Welch, please let me know. He was chaplain of the 5th Connecticut, and he preferred to stay with the men in battle. His colonel noted that his chaplain was invariably found at the front encouraging the men by his presence. Unfortunately, because he was near the front, Chaplain Welch was captured with a few other men of his regiment on the evening of July 2nd at Gettysburg, when his regiment tried to reoccupy the breastworks on Culp's Hill, which had been taken over by Confederates. Well, the chaplain either escaped or was released soon afterwards because he did return to his regiment by July 4th. Now, some chaplains became very frustrated by the Army's failure to clearly define their duties and their expectations. They were also frustrated by a lack of support from some of their commanding officers, which made them feel like their place or their role in the Army was just not important. Reverend Frederick Dennison served as chaplain to 2 different Rhode Island regiments. He was discouraged to learn that a chaplain had no appointment or recognized place. On a march, in a bivouac, or in a line of battle, He was a supernumerary, a kind of fifth wheel to a coach, being in place nowhere and out of place everywhere. Chaplain James Junius Marks of the 63rd Pennsylvania would agree. He wrote, "Nowhere can the chaplain look in hope for help, the government giving him indeed his commission, but not assigning his duties, nor compelling the other officers of the regiment to help him and sustain him in his work. The duties of other officers are prescribed, definite, and minute, but for him, all is uncertainty." Most chaplains simply did the same kind of ministry they were used to doing at home in their churches, leading worship on Sunday mornings, providing Bible studies, leading prayer meetings, providing counsel for the men, and of course, visiting and praying with the wounded and the dying. But many chaplains soon learned that there were a lot of other things they could do for the men that did not fall under the heading of spiritual care, such as caring for the regimental mail, writing or reading letters for those who were sick or injured or illiterate, teaching soldiers how to read, and writing letters home to the families of soldiers who had fallen in battle. Chaplains sometimes assumed the responsibility of making sure that the men's pay made it safely back to their families. The 148th Pennsylvania received several months of pay in April of 1863, and they asked their chaplain, William Stevens, that he be sent home with their money. And so he carried $45,000 wrapped up in individual packages, and he carried them all the way back to Center County, where each package was safely delivered to each soldier's family. Most chaplains and commanders believed that there were three dangerous threats to the morale, the discipline, and the readiness of troops in camp. And those were the sins of profanity, drunkenness, and gambling. Chaplains, I would imagine, were probably frustrated to learn that some of the best generals in the Army, including General Winfield Scott Hancock, were very well versed in that horrible sin of profanity. Chaplain Stevens of the 148th PA was at the Second Corps Hospital when General Hancock was brought in after being wounded on July 3rd at Gettysburg. Stevens described the moment when the surgeons discovered that there was a nail embedded in the general's upper thigh, which of course had come from the pommel of his saddle. Stevens delicately recalled that the remarks made by the general when told of the discovery were not exactly religious. Chaplains were uniquely suited to raise morale in perhaps one of the most efficient means possible, through faith and through the promises of a heavenly reward for duty fulfilled. Father Corby's absolution undoubtedly helped some of the men of the Irish Brigade to go into battle with the assurance that if they fell, they had already received absolution from their sins, and they would indeed receive that eternal reward. But preparing men to fight and brutally kill their enemies created moral and theological dilemmas for chaplains and for individual soldiers. Captain Benjamin W. Thompson of the 111th New York Infantry served on the skirmish line west of Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg on the morning of July 3rd. As he described it, line fighting is barbarous, but skirmishing is savage, nay, devilish. To juke and hide and skulk for men and deliberately aim at and murder them one by one is far too bloodthirsty business for Christian men. And that is the struggle between faith and duty that chaplains had to acknowledge and address so that they could help equip their men to do their duty, no matter how savage or bloodthirsty. Soldiers highly respected those chaplains who willingly did anything they could that would bring the men some comfort. In addition, soldiers preferred chaplains who were not proud or flashy in their religion, who never took advantage of their rank, and who could adapt their finely tuned religious sensibilities to the realities of serving in an army. When the 145th Pennsylvania was enduring its hard marches toward Gettysburg, Chaplain John Stuckenberg would occasionally climb down off his horse and walk beside the men so an exhausted soldier could ride. In addition to being a strong moral and spiritual presence, chaplains were expected to demonstrate courage, both on and off the battlefield. Chaplain H. Clay Trumbull of the 10th Connecticut wrote, "A chaplain had a duty to inspire the men. If the chaplain was a coward or seemed unready to face the perils of the soldiers, then no words from him could carry any weight with the men. On the other hand, if the chaplain shared their dangers bravely, his men gave him more than full credit for his courage and were all the more ready to do their duty under his direct appeals." And as you can imagine, chaplains needed a lot of courage, physical courage, emotional courage, and spiritual courage to help them carry out their duty to the soldiers, not only on the battlefield, but in other tragic circumstances off the battlefield. Reverend James Junius Marks of the 63rd Pennsylvania was helping to care for wounded soldiers at the field hospital near Savage Station on the Virginia Peninsula. He learned that General McClellan had ordered a retreat, or a change of base, across the peninsula to the James River. Reverend Marks learned that all wounded men who could not accompany the army on foot would be left behind to the mercy of the advancing Confederates. Chaplain Marks wrote, "When it became manifest that these wounded men would be left behind, the scene could not be pictured by human language. Some wounded men struggled through the ground, exclaiming they would rather die than fall into the hands of the rebels." Chaplain Marks chose to stay behind with some 230 wounded men at the hospital, and he became a prisoner, was sent off to prison, and was not with his regiment when they fought at Gettysburg. When the 7th Wisconsin Infantry was marching toward Gettysburg in June 1863, Chaplain Samuel Witt Eaton witnessed the execution of a young man in the 19th Indiana for desertion. A chaplain knelt with him. His breast was laid bare and was pierced by several shots. He fell backwards from his coffin. The lieutenant, observing that he still moved, ordered others to fire, and his brain was pierced. We left very quickly, while men were hastily digging the grave. Chaplain Trumbull of the 10th Connecticut believed that men in a regiment appreciated the presence of their chaplain because, he said, they felt stronger if one whom they looked to as God's representative was near them. Trumbull cited the words of a captain in his regiment who said, "We count our chaplain as good as 100 men in a fight because the men fight so much better when he's with them." And an anonymous chaplain voiced his concern in a letter that he had sent home to his newspaper, and he wrote, "Nothing will so much inspire a soldier to noble deeds of daring as that sanctioned by the prayers and presence of a pious chaplain." This painting is a small sketch of a very large 15 by 20-foot fresco that is in the former Camp Curtin Memorial Methodist Episcopal Church here in Harrisburg. The church was built in the 1890s on the site of a Union Army recruiting and training camp, and it was later dedicated as a memorial to all Civil War soldiers. An artist was commissioned to paint a large mural for the sanctuary that depicted Christ appearing to a fallen soldier. And for me, this painting sums up what I believe most chaplains really wanted to impart to their soldiers, and that was the assurance that even if they fell in battle, Christ would be with them to comfort them. Now, of the more than 250 volunteer infantry and cavalry regiments present during the Battle of Gettysburg, about 130 of them had chaplains with them. Only about 50 of those left any kind of written record of their experience of Gettysburg, including regimental histories, letters, articles, memoirs. Those are the stories that I include in my book. But for the 80 or so other chaplains, all I could find was fragmentary biographical information, and I was not able to include them in the book, although in the appendix, their names are all listed. So I'd like to share just a couple of these brief stories. William Chittenden Way was chaplain of the 24th Michigan. He stayed behind in Gettysburg when the rest of the Army left to pursue the Confederates. Chaplain Way worked at field hospitals all around the field and at Camp Letterman. But he did more than that. As one surgeon reported, Chaplain Way learned that 30 bodies of his regiment were still lying unburied on the battlefield where they fell. He took 2 men who were but slightly wounded, and they went a mile and a half out to the field and with their own hands buried their comrades. Chaplain Way later sadly noted that many of the dead had been robbed of everything, their bodies stripped of clothing and shoes. After the battle, Chaplain Way visited John Burns at his home while Burns was recovering from the wounds he had received while fighting with the Iron Brigade on July 1st. Chaplain Way thanked Mr. Burns for his service and later described him as that old patriot who shouldered his musket and went to the field and fought. He is made of the right kind of stuff. William Locke of the 11th Pennsylvania went to work in the field hospital at Christ Lutheran Church on July 1st. He described what he witnessed later that afternoon. We were going in and out of the hospital when the broken and flying battalions of the 11th Corps came streaming in. It was a sight never to be forgotten. Crowding through the streets and up the alleys and over fences in utter ignorance of where they were going, every moment increased the confusion and dismay. To add to the terrors of the hour, the enemy gained possession of the town, and firing rapidly into our retreating ranks, shot and shell mingled their horrid sounds with the groans of the dying thus stricken down. Locke reported that the citizens spent the next 2 days in Gettysburg in utter ignorance of what was going on just south of town in the battle because the Confederates in town refused to tell the people in town anything about what was happening. But on the evening of July 3rd, he noticed that there was evident uneasiness among the Confederates. There were no shouts of victory like there had been the previous day. Then, in the morning of July 4th, he saw a strong line of Union skirmishers advancing through the streets of Gettysburg, and Chaplain Locke watched as doors and windows of houses that had been closed up tight were thrown open, and he saw people's faces beaming with hope and joy. Louis Beaudry was chaplain of the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and although he didn't see a lot of actual fighting during the Battle of Gettysburg, he had a very unfortunate experience following the battle. As his unit moved toward Monterey Pass on July 5th in pursuit of Lee's army, Chaplain Beaudry reported, "In company with another chaplain and a few other defenseless ones, I was suddenly and unexpectedly surrounded by a detachment of Jenkins' cavalry. It was very hard for me to say, 'I surrender.' But with assurances that neither my horse nor any of my personal property would be taken from me, I felt much better. Beaudry had been told that once he and the other captives reached Jeb Stuart's headquarters, they would be released. But instead, he found that he was indeed released of his horse and of all hopes of liberty. He even met with General Jeb Stuart to argue for his rights as a non-combatant to be immediately released, but to no avail. Beaudry and the others were marched off to Libby Prison in Richmond, and he and the other chaplains were released in a prisoner exchange a few months later. One of the most remarkable stories of a chaplain service at Gettysburg comes from William Eastman of the 72nd New York in the Excelsior Brigade. Late on July 3rd, Eastman was riding across the field after the fighting had died down, looking for wounded and dying men that he could help. Suddenly, his horse was startled by an exploding shell. The horse fell on him and severely wrenched his knee. Here's the rest of the story as told by Major General Oliver Otis Howard. The night came on, and the chaplain found himself lying helpless on the ground. Several times he tried to rise, only to fall back with increased suffering. Soon he heard a groan not far from him. Then apparently he heard swearing. Then, listening more attentively, he detected the voice of prayer coming from lips that seemed unaccustomed to such petition. He called out to the man, who immediately begged him to come to his relief. As the chaplain could not rise or walk, it occurred to him to work his way over to that wounded soldier by rolling. So over and over, with much pain, he rolled until he reached the wounded soldier. He stayed with the soldier as his lifeblood ebbed away, and he had hardly closed the man's eyes in death when a party with an officer came upon him. The leader of the party said, "Here, chaplain, over here is another man that needs your help." The chaplain said, "But I cannot walk. I am so severely wounded. But I will go if you carry me." General Howard continues, "So all that night, without heeding his own pain, Chaplain Eastman had himself carried by a couple of men from dying man to dying man all over that terrible field. It has struck me that there was no display of generous, heroic conduct at Gettysburg superior to that of Chaplain William R. Eastman." Perhaps the best way to wrap up this presentation is to share this summary of a chaplain's service and duty. This passage comes from an address that Chaplain Eastman gave in 1911, and I have invited Wayne to read that for us.
I don't think I'm worthy to read it, but I will give my best shot. Quote, "In one word, the significance of the chaplaincy was this, that the government offered to each regiment one man to be a friend to every man. While other officers might be good friends, this man was to make a business of kindness, not a commander, not a fighter, not hemmed in by any rules or any rank, left to himself to reach men by their hearts, if he touched them at all, and by their hearts to make them better soldiers, a man to be sought in the hour of need, to stand for truth, purity, and all the righteousness, for honorable living and hopeful dying, and having done all to stand by in the spirit of service according to the pattern of the master. Many regiments did not understand and did not care. Many commanders found it impossible to secure the man they would gladly have welcomed to a post. Many men undertook the service fell short, perhaps far short, of their opportunities. But many also gained for themselves much love and a good name and a share in the final triumph." End quote.
So that brings my presentation to an end, and I'm going to turn it back over to our delightful MC, Okay.
Nancy, we want to thank you so much for taking your time, and we want to thank you and Gettysburg Publishing for releasing the book here at the National Civil War Museum. We're honored to be able to do that today. We thank all of you for attending. I'm going to send Nancy out to get over to that table, and then I'm going to make a last-minute announcement. I want to make sure she gets out there to sign books. For all of you, get yourself a copy of Nancy's new book and learn more about the history of these chaplains. It's just simply fascinating. I want to thank Brett Kelly for having these items and Katie back there at the table. These items are fantastic items. Chaplain Calkins, who she mentioned, there is a letter he carried back there on that table, and there is a letter in the hand of Chaplain Lorenzo Barber of the 2nd United States Sharpshooters laying back on that table that he wrote to Charlotte King. Mrs. King was the mother of one of the sharpshooters who was ill. As Nancy mentioned, it was often the chaplain's responsibility to write these letters about death in men who are sick and men who are wounded. And that letter laying on the back of the table back there is an excellent letter, all in Chaplain Barber's own hand. Brett also put out a beautiful coat back there, which is an exact type that a chaplain would wear in the Civil War. 9-button front coat, all in black on that table. So these are out on the table from the collections of the National Civil War Museum, courtesy of Brett, our curator, getting them all ready for you. They will go back into storage when you're done, so be sure that you get a look at them on the way out. We thank all of you for coming. Stay tuned for the website and our social media channels for the happenings next year here at the National Civil War Museum. We're going to keep a full and active calendar. And if you want to get early notices of that, there's no better way than to become a member here at the National Civil War Museum and support us. And you can go right in the gift shop right now today, and the folks in there will take care of that. So we hope all of you have a wonderful and safe holiday season and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.